Well, thank you guys. Good morning. Very, very excited to be chatting with you guys this morning. As a little bit of an extension of some of the diversity content from yesterday. As important as diversity is, I think maybe even one full day of content is not enough. So we're kind of happy to extend that conversation into today to talk a little bit about how we can move the ball earlier in the clinical trials process with regards to clinical trial diversity. The slides. Here we go. So my name is Kent Siri. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Reify Health, and I'm also the head of our diversity initiatives there. And I'm honored to be joined by two really thought leaders in the space of clinical trial diversity. Neha Shah-Londoño, who's the Director of Global Clinical Trial Diversity and Inclusion at Seagen. And joining us from Indiana is Natalie Chung-Rotelli, who's an advisor in diversity and clinical trials for Lilly. There's a lot to cover. The topic of diversity and pushing strategies for earlier. We could take a full day to talk about that content, but I really want to start maybe asking our panelists first, what sort of sparked your passion, ignited your passion to focus on diversity specifically as your career focus? Maybe Neha, if you don't mind starting.
Sure. Okay, this is on. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and discuss this important topic. It's been a key trend and topic today through the many days at Scope, and I'm really excited to talk about it here with you today, specifically with the Reify team. What I think all of us, when we look back on our career and we think about the turns and curves and pitfalls and challenges that led us to, where we are here, or what drives our passion, for me, it was a real, collision course of personal priorities and social justice work that I do personally that intersected with my clinical trials career. And so when the pandemic happened and I happened to be at my previous employer and everyone in industry was looking to, really pivot and address everything we had to do with being addressing what was in front of us in 2020, the opportunity presented itself. And so throughout my career, I had really gracefully integrated diversity and inclusion in many ways, working with physicians of color, selecting sites where there was underprivileged or historically excluded patients. But now that we're seeing actual departments and resources put forth towards this, it's a real honor to be able to serve in this way.
Great. And Natalie, how about you? What ignited the passion and the focus in diversity?
Yes, much like, first of all, thank you for having me. Real honor to be with you all here today. Much like Neha, I was called to action. A lot of racial inequities and injustice were definitely coming to the surface. And I'm grateful that this job allowed me an opportunity to say, well, within the walls of this company that makes medicines for people, what can we do? Also drawing from my statistics background, understanding we had a wealth of information that we could really get into and interrogate and make data-driven decisions to allow opportunities for more for the minority community. And then also personally, just growing up in a small town in North Carolina, being one of the only Asian people, and just thinking about how we could be more inclusive, period.
As a kid who grew up in Texas, I feel that very, very deeply. So we're not going to spend too much time here. I think we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about where we are as an industry with regards to clinical trial diversity. And I think the answer to that question is probably not where we want to be, right? If this slide is really meant to show, really even in the recent past, this is only my third scope, but this is about my 15th year attending healthcare conferences and healthcare technology conferences. The topic of diversity in clinical trials has been a topic that has received varying levels of prioritization and discourse in that 15 years. And certainly, as Neha mentioned, with the social justice work that's happening right now with the pandemic, certainly the conversation has evolved and heightened in the last couple of years, but this issue precedes 2020, it precedes 2019. It even precedes 2015 or even the FDA legislation, right? I'm not going to get into detail about this. I think most of the folks in the room are very familiar with, the history of mistreatment of racial and ethnic minorities, specifically within healthcare, and then even more specifically within medical research, right? This is really to highlight, this is not a 2020s problem. It's not a 2010s problem or a 2000s problem. And the challenge and the solutions are not going to be complete this year or next year, right? We as an industry have to be prepared to really dig in our heels and do the work today and for several years to come, right? We hope to solve this problem not in 2022, but hopefully over the course of the next decade, et cetera, because there's a lot of work to do. And I think as some of the content over the last couple of days has shown, we're starting to really identify some of those tactics and levers and pieces where we can actually push and pull and affect change. And what we're going to talk about today is highlighting some of those levers and where we can push and pull those, hopefully earlier in the game. So I'm going to pause here and again, go back to the panelists and maybe get in a little bit more detail, starting with you, Neha, as to what the sponsor response has been around the sort of evolving dialogue in clinical trial diversity.
Yep, great question. So I think, it's interesting. I was in the hallway before, checking email and, trying to ignore the growing emails I've not responded to. And I overheard some women talking about some of the sessions they had attended, and one in particular where yesterday it was presented on behalf of Takeda, where they were talking about connecting to communities and how to leverage that within your growth of your diversity strategy for your company. And the women were saying that was fantastic. And then there was another presentation where they were talking about tools and how do you engage? How do you take that further? We understand that there's a step-by-step process. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a multi-pronged approach, but the question is how? So I think companies, depending on their areas of focus, their size and scale, their global footprint, are really trying to assess what makes sense within their resources, what is commonly understood across industry. And Natalie and I had actually how we met was an industry-wide effort through Transcelerate. It was a wonderful opportunity where it is a sense of collaboration and not competition, which this industry is fraught with, right? And here we have pillars where we really commonly understand it takes, a cultural mind shift and change that is embedded within the company. You must listen to your patients and really apply those insights from soup to nuts. And in addition to that, there's an evolution of how you approach that and tailor what you do. In our discussions, it was almost akin to precision medicine, thinking about not just taking off the shelf and applying what you've done. There's an evolution of approach when it comes to thinking about how we develop our medicines and conduct our trials.
Great. And Natalie, I'm curious, we talked a little bit about the kind of recent events with regards to the pandemic and social justice. I'm curious from your perspective, what effect those kind of larger macro events and trends have had on public perceptions of clinical research, specifically within underserved communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we sort of addressed this earlier with how we're here today. And as Neha was saying, what we're doing as an industry to rise together. COVID and its disproportionate effect on minorities was highlighted. And we also bear witness to a lot of things that were disproportionately affecting minorities. And I think we took a beat to say, what can we do better? We know, Lilly, industry, everyone, we know we're not where we want to be, and what can we do? And I do think it starts with with understanding, acknowledging the mistrust in the past, understanding the barriers, and then saying, how, to Neha's point, like really changing and tailoring our trial designs and our strategies to say, how can we be much more inclusive? And a lot of the things we do, maybe they're not really complex, but they are activities and strategies that we're finally really being specific to helping minority and underrepresented communities.
Absolutely. How about you, Neha? What have you noticed with regards to the public perceptions of research, specifically within racial and ethnic minority groups, and how that's changed with regards to COVID?
Significant. I live in Texas and have a wide variety of friends and family from different backgrounds. And, I always, because this is not a prevalent industry in Texas, no one knew what I did. I was like, Chandler from Friends, like no one knows what he really did, and now, everyone is using the word efficacy and, understand what adverse effect means or event. And they're more informed and more empowered. And it gave rise to meaningfully, feeling they have the place to ask the questions of, is this, drug being tested in me, really thinking about the full scope of what they're taking and what that means for their health. At birthday parties, for my 7-year-old daughter, just had a birthday party for her. And I had a conversation with a neighbor who has sickle cell and really asking about, I don't know. I know there are a lot of Black women and African-American women who are impacted by this. I don't know if it's really been tested with the safety profiles. And I wouldn't have never engaged in this type of discussion before. So it is in the ethos and in the atmosphere, and we have a responsibility to do something about it.
Absolutely. Speaking of doing something about it, I think what we really want to focus the core of this discussion on is evolving the dialogue away from here are the things that we should do to here are the things that we can do. And specifically, we now can dig into how to do those things, when to do those things, to what magnitude we need to do those things. It really starts, as far as we're concerned, with a diagnostic, right? And knowing what we don't know. I think in one of the early conversations with Neha and Natalie, I think Natalie mentioned, before you build a bridge, right, you kind of have to measure the gap, right? You have to know how deep and how wide that gap is before you can start building that bridge. And I think the approach to solving for diversity in clinical trials really starts with measuring. You can't really solve a problem. It's really impossible to solve a problem until you're able to measure that problem in depth. And the issue that we've identified, right, is that when we talk about clinical trial diversity, and a lot of the statistics that you guys see, there's countless papers, peer-reviewed articles that have been out there about the state of clinical trial participants and what they show broadly and consistently. Even as recently as some of the 2021 and studies regarding vaccine enrollment, is that they look at clinical trial enrollment, right, which is important. Right. But as we know, in terms of the overall process of clinical trial and how it operates, it's fairly late in the game. There's a ton of activity that happens with sites and patients and sponsors prior to enrollment. And that data right now exists a little bit in a blind spot right now. There's not a ton of systematic data capture because there's very minimal technology being implemented systematically for sites and sponsors to be able to capture that data, for patients to be able to log that data, right? So the issue is that when we evaluate some of those solutions, evaluate some of that data is coming off of a point in the clinical trial process that is, again, fairly late in the game. Imagine if you're Sean McVay, the coach of the LA Rams, and you can't make in-game adjustments. How can you be expected to actually perform well in the Super Bowl on Sunday? You have to be able to make changes on the fly. And that's very much how we have been thinking about this problem with Neha and Natalie and some of the other partners of Reify Health. Once you identify the questions to ask, then you start to fill in those gaps. And so the data that you see here with regards to Black research candidates and white research candidates comes from an analysis of our amazing data team, some of whom are actually here in the room, where we looked at 13,000 identified research candidates, Black and white candidates. We collect the information across all racial and ethnic groups, but we're specifically sort of drawing a comparison between white and Black candidates to make a point, right? You look at how they behave through this funnel from their initial interest, right, or being identified as a potential candidate for a trial, moving into pre-screening, scheduling their first visit, actually going into screening, and finally enrolling and completing a trial. And you can notice some differences in the funnel, but I think that the distinction and the impact really comes into light when you overlay those funnels. And here's when you can really start to see where major differences between Black and white candidate behavior in the enrollment funnel, or how they're affected by that enrollment process, vary disproportionately between Black and white candidates. And so what you can see here is that once a patient is a candidate is identified or raises their hand and says, hey, I'm interested in a trial, they're just as likely to move into that pre-screening stage, right? But as we get further down the funnel, we see that Black candidates are 21% less likely to schedule their first visit after pre-screening. Furthermore, they're 19% less likely to move into screening after scheduling their first visit. After that, they're 21% less likely to enroll in the trial after screening. But then at the very bottom of the funnel, they're just as likely to complete a trial once they are actually enrolled in that trial. So this is where I want to pause and maybe dig in a little bit deeper with Natalie and Neha. And specifically, as you look at data like this, right, what types of insights you can pull out as sponsors, and specifically how this affects things like site or patient strategy. Natalie, maybe if you'd like to take a first pass.
Yes, I mean, as we're still learning and we're still understanding the myriad of reasons why we have lower minority participation. It is patient level data like this that helps us understand what's happening and when and why. It helps us understand the minority patient journey. And that allows us to understand where the gaps are and what we need to do better. And to your point of this patient level data and then a site level data, this allows us to understand what's happening at each site, which gives us the opportunity to reach out to sites and say, how can we better support you into reaching minority communities? What can we do to partner with you? And also, if there are sites that are doing well, what can we learn from you to do better? So when it comes to strategy and trial design and building things that allow for minority participation, it starts with understanding what's happening earlier, and it maybe even be more precise about when.
Neha, what about you? What does this sort of bring to light for you in terms of strategic planning?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything Natalie said. And I think, the insights gained from being able to have those tailored conversations with the sites is critical, right? You get to assess in the funnel with their conversations along the patient journey where there might be those gaps and what might be impacting them. And then internally, you're able to pivot and analyze data through the study team portal, through what you're able to analyze around pinpointing each specific patient, looking at aggregated data around specific entry criteria, and make then strategic decisions. Working at a biotech company that's very fast-paced and committed to really delivering, highly complex programs with biomarkers and different lab assessments and complicated disease assessments is important. So if you are creating a protocol that may be too complex, if this signals to you that we are requiring a biomarker that may not be readily prevalent within this community, which we know the epidemiology shows there's a prevalence of disease within the Latinx community or Black or African American patients, yet we're not finding them to really qualify for our study. This allows us insight to be able to make those changes and tailor accordingly. And so it goes back to my introduction of how do we do this, right? We have the key pillars, but then how do we execute? How do we apply the information that we're seeing in the data and really pivot to ensure we're reaching the patients?
Great. I think one thing that really stands out to me is you look again at these data, the stark difference between Black patients versus white patients, specifically moving from the pre-screening stage into in-screening, right? And what we know sort of about those stages in the clinical operations or the clinical trial funnel is that's when a lot of screening goes from over the phone or virtual to in-person in a clinic where, you know, there may be blood draws or there may be more sort of invasive things. We talked a lot at length, I think yesterday, about some of the operational barriers, right? And you know, there's travel, there's taking time off from work, there's childcare, et cetera, which oftentimes, as we know from a socioeconomic perspective, affects certain populations differently and their abilities to participate in those types of activities. The other thing that we know in terms of that progression in the funnel is that's where informed consent comes into play, and a lot of patient education materials come into play. Natalie, I think you talked a little bit about you know, mistrust and distrust, right, within certain communities, specifically in underrepresented communities. I'm wondering, you know, maybe Natalie, starting with you, what are your perspectives with regards to how the industry, how sponsors should be investing in different types of and formats of communication to break down those barriers of trust that may disproportionately affect certain populations?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, as Neha was saying, a lot of clinical development is complex, but we need to be able to communicate what we're doing and be transparent about and sharing what we're doing with each person. I think that can only increase trust. So there's, I know across industry and certainly at Lilly, there are a tremendous amount of efforts around health literacy and cultural competency and assuring that what we're doing in these trials, what data we're taking from you, what information we're taking from you, that we also give back. And then there's always, of course, even before talking about clinical trials, doing a much better job of reaching minority communities and educating about disease state, period. And before we even start talking about the clinical trials. And these are all really important and foundational efforts that have only been highlighted more and more recently.
And Neha, what about you? Does anything in your work kind of support that idea that there are varying levels of barriers of trust within you know, within certain minority groups?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, through insights that we've gained in our work with patient advocacy groups and, you know, going into the community, you know, the message has always been the same. It was the same before the pandemic, it's the same after the pandemic. Now there's voice and, you know, actually what we've seen proof of, you know, with the development of the vaccine and access to care and, you know, mortality. So it's then again our responsibility to listen and learn and understand, you know, what we need to do to tailor our messaging accordingly. Certainly educate all, outreach for all that may qualify and are, you know, impacted by the disease. And then also thinking about going to the communities in a way that is, you know, represented by trust. And then we have a responsibility then to be trustworthy and seen and prove that through investments of lifting the community through different avenues, whether it's STEM or investment in investigators of color or areas where we can just propagate this understanding of health and care and how clinical trials can be a part of that within their opportunity if they're seeking healthcare.
100%. Yeah, thank you. I know we're running a little bit short on time. I do want to make sure that I give you know, both of you a chance just to maybe plug some work that you're doing. So I'm curious, Natalie, do you have one initiative or maybe a set of initiatives that you and your team are working on or that you're familiar with that you want to give a little airtime to or add a little shine to?
Yeah, I guess there's very little I'm not excited about this year. You know, last year we was a year of discovery and moving forward with what we knew. To your point, we're shining lights on areas that we know less about. I'm very excited about having an understanding of what's happening in the patient journey and applying it to our clinical trials, which is kind of high level, but ultimately assuring that our clinical trials are as inclusive as possible through some of these efforts with Reify, looking at more data, and then also absolutely working within the communities. And then through these consortiums like Transcelerate to ensure that we're all working together, because we can't do this alone.
Absolutely. Neha, what about you? What's an initiative or a set of initiatives you're excited about?
Well, same as Natalie, I feel very fortunate to, be at CGen and, within the environment where it's really culturally pervasive, everyone is committed to applying and integrating DEI within every aspect of work. And, as our company is expanding and growing in their global footprint, one thing that I'm especially excited about is how we are looking to look to other parts of the world to establish efforts to understand what diversity looks like, in different regions, to understand what the regulation might be to meet those demands, because, the US is certainly leading with, regulation and expectation, and the rest of the world is closely following. We're seeing that already. So, that's been a very, very exciting.
Yeah, the global diversity lens is something I think that deserves a lot more attention and questions being asked. So really important work. I don't know if we have time for any questions.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Question, quick answer.
Yeah, I'll just take 30 seconds of those 2 minutes. Cameron Snyder, Circa Clinical. We run an IRO, Integrated Research Organization, which really stands up physicians who have amazing relationships with patients and turn them into PIs, if that makes sense. What do you think about these statistics? Because these are really tough ones. If that physician has an amazing relationship in community outreach programs, do you think we can actually influence those percentages?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe very quickly speaking from the Reify lens. So our sort of sister organization, Care Access Research, they're doing a lot of this work. Sorry, Care Access is doing a lot of this work right now specifically. And this is why I talked about, this is not sort of an overnight solution or even a solution that's going to happen over the course of, a year. When we talk about chipping away at some of these deltas, right, we're talking about engaging and activating communities that may not be familiar with the operations of a clinical trial. There may be, providers out there who are interested in participating in this work, or some that maybe don't know much about the participation in clinical trials. And part of the work that they're doing is identifying and activating those communities, right, and getting them set up to run clinical trials so that we can start to eat away at some of these disparities. I don't know, Natalie, Neha, if you guys have any thoughts specifically on that piece.
I just want to say to the person who asked the questions, thank you for your work. We absolutely need to support and stand up more minority investigators and new and upcoming talent.
We have run out of time for the virtual folks. If you want to stick around and answer some questions, it's
Okay.
for a few minutes. We do have a break that's set up now in the exhibit hall. Anybody who is leaving, please return by 11:20. Okay.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so
Thank
much. Thank you,
you.
Natalie. Thanks for joining us.
Yes.
And thank you,
Thank you,
Neha.
Neha. Thank you,
Maybe
Ken.
stick around. She might still be on. Natalie, are you staying on
Thank
for a
you.
minute?
I can stay on a few
Of
minutes.
course, yeah, I've got.
Natalie, or Neha as well, real quick question. Natalie, you touched on it before. Before that funnel, there's a big part of this of, engaging with the minority communities, to help diversify. How do you do that? I mean, pharma companies aren't set up to engage and build communities and things like that. So what are the steps you follow?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not going to knock on doors and say we're Lilly and we want you to trust us. And then ultimately, to our points, there's there's talking about disease states and saying, this is what's happening with breast cancer. This is what's happening for your community with breast cancer. And this is how you're more adversely affected. So I think it's working with those trusted community intermediaries and allowing them to have the trust of the community and us just talk about disease states and opportunities. That is, we're very at Lilly. Yeah, this matters a lot because we're not running in and the first thing we're doing is talking about our clinical trials. We realize there's a foundation of health equity that we need to set first. I'll let Neha speak more.
Yeah, no, I echo what Natalie was saying, and we touched upon it, earlier, that it's a comprehensive approach where there's education, there's outreach, there's understanding well before, you have even stepped foot into your doctor's office. It's something that you're able to access, whether it's searching online, through communities that you're involved with, where you live, through advertisements on the radio, through in your newspaper, through articles, things like that. And this information has really been provided by patient communities, representatives or advocates for Black and Brown communities. So it's long-standing, in the work that we've done. I've done at previous companies, and then even here at CGen, it resonates. It's definitely, involve us in your decision making and how you communicate and the voice that's being used.
There's one question up here.
So thank you. It's really great to see a lot of the interest in diversity. I think COVID really sparked that. I do think that in terms of trying to increase clinical trial diversity, I think there are two key components we should always take in mind. You've talked a lot about the technology and the data, which I think is really important, but also the relationship aspect. I think many times, as someone who comes from an underserved community, I can say that many times I think when groups like this come into the community, it's always like a talking down. And it's really important that as we are trying to build the bridges, that we learn to speak in the language of the people that we speak to. That's really critical in terms of the respect. That's one. And two, we have to be able to identify trusted partners within the community. Mm-hmm. A Lilly or a Merck, with all due respect, doesn't just come into the community and talk about their studies. You'll move the needle that way. But it means that the Lilly or the Mercks understand who the trusted leaders are within those communities and work with those communities to break the barriers down, because these are psychological barriers. So I'm hoping that the more we talk and we focus on clinical diversity, that the more we bring solutions that are actually meaningful and move the needle. Otherwise, it seems more of a lot of campaigns, and again, that adds to the lack of trust. Okay, and I like what she said, which is making sure that there is an investment within the community, so doesn't become a transactional relationship. I'm trying to do this because I'm trying to get this many number, but that you're actually in there. Because clinical trials that are representative of all of us benefit all of us. So thank you.
Very well said. Thank you.
Did anyone else have a question? I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.